The rain began with a soft hiss, a curtain of droplets blurring the edges of the city. I hadn't intended to stop. My plan had been to walk through the storm and let it soak away the frustration of another long week. Yet, as the rain thickened, I ducked into the nearest doorway, an old, wooden frame painted in faded green. The sign above it swung more on rusty chains, the name obscured by age. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old wood. The dim light filtering through yellowed glass revealed a cramped space filled with strange objects. Time-worn books with crumbling spines, delicate glass bottles, and shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten trinkets. It was as though the shop had been frozen in time, untouched by the years outside. I should have left immediately, but something rooted me in place. My eyes scanned the clutter until they fell upon a small cabinet near the back. Its contents glimmered faintly, a collection of jewelry, tarnished by years of neglect. There, nestled among the bracelets and brooches, was a locket. The locket wasn't particularly ornate, yet it seemed to call to me. Its brass surface bore faint etchings of ivy leaves winding around its edges, and a tiny clasp at its center begged to be opened. I reached for it, and as my fingers brushed the cool metal, a peculiar sensation washed over me, a fleeting chill, as if someone had whispered my name just behind my ear. "It's yours for a modest price, Terossi," came a voice from the shadows. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a voice like dry paper, stepped forward. His sudden presence made me flinch. "How much?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the oppressive quiet. He named a figure so low it seemed almost laughable. I fumbled for the money and handed it to him, desperate to leave the shop and the weighty silence that had settled around me. The locket fit perfectly into my palm, warm now, as though it had absorbed the heat of my skin. I slipped it into my pocket and stepped back out into the rain, but the storm had lessened, the air now heavy and still. As I walked home, the locket pressed against me with every step, a peculiar sense of unease growing in the back of my mind. That night, I dreamed. In the dream, I stood in a darkened room. A woman sat in the corner, her back to me, her head bowed as though in prayer. Her hair, long and dark, spilled over her shoulders, and she wore a dress that seemed far too old-fashioned for the world I knew. I wanted to speak, to ask her who she was, but my throat was dry, and no sound escaped. She turned her head slightly, and though I couldn't see her face, her voice filled the room, soft and mournful. "You have it," she said. "You must give it back." When I awoke, the words lingered like a distant echo. The locket sat on my nightstand, glinting faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. The following day, the dream remained fresh in my mind, its details refusing to fade with the morning light. I told myself it was nothing, a stray thought woven into the fabric of sleep. But the locket seemed heavier now, as though it carried the weight of the dream within its brass shell. I placed it around my neck. The chain was delicate but surprisingly sturdy, and as it settled against my skin, a strange warmth pulsed from it, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. I told myself it was silly to think there was anything unusual about a simple piece of jewelry. The first oddity came that afternoon. I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror, and for a moment, it didn't feel like my own. My face was there, yet it seemed slightly wrong. The angles sharper, the eyes darker, as though a shadow had passed over it. I leaned closer, staring, and as I did, a faint shape flickered in the background. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the tiled walls and the faint hum of the air conditioning. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I touched the locket instinctively. It was cool now, a sharp contrast to my clammy skin. By evening, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the television. I chalked it up to the wind rattling the old windows or the distant hum of the pipes in my apartment. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew clearer, weaving words I couldn't quite understand. Each syllable seemed to press against the edges of my mind, compelling me to listen. "You must give it back," they seemed to say, a chorus of voices blending together into a single, haunting plea. I retreated to my bedroom, my hands trembling as I unhooked the locket and placed it in the drawer of my bedside table. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, filling the quiet night with their unrelenting insistence. That night, the dream returned. The woman stood closer now, her features obscured by the shadows that clung to her like a veil. Her voice was urgent, trembling with barely contained despair. "You don't understand," she said. "It isn't yours. It will never be yours." When I woke, the drawer was open, the locket resting atop the table, gleaming in the pale light of dawn. By the third day, the locket's presence had become an inescapable part of my life. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though I was being watched, even when I was alone. Shadows seemed to linger longer, stretching unnaturally across the walls. The whispers continued, though now they were no longer faint. They filled every quiet moment with their haunting refrain, "You must give it back." Desperate for answers, I decided to seek out help. The internet provided little solace. Vague folklore and half-hearted theories about haunted artifacts weren't enough. But amidst the pages of myths and legends, I found a name. Ezra Whitlock, an expert in antiques and arcane histories. He owned a small appraisal shop a few miles away. On impulse, I grabbed the locket and left, hoping he could shed some light on the situation. The shop was tucked away on a side street, a narrow building with dusty windows that gave it an air of forgotten wisdom. Inside, the air smelled of parchment and wood polish. The shelves were lined with books and peculiar artifacts, each one whispering of a past long since buried. Whitlock himself was an older man with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through me as I stepped inside. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly but kind. I hesitated, then pulled the locket from my pocket. I think there's something wrong with this." His gaze sharpened as I placed it on the counter. Without touching it, he leaned closer, studying the intricate design. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence grew heavy, filled with the sound of my own shallow breathing. "Where did you find this?" he asked finally. I explained about the antique shop, the inexplicable pull I'd felt, and the dreams. His expression darkened with every word. "This isn't an ordinary locket," he said, his tone grave. "It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Arbridge. She lived in the late 1800s, a recluse who was said to have dabbled in the occult. Her death was sudden and unexplained, and her personal effects disappeared shortly after. Rumors suggest she bound part of herself to this locket, ensuring she would never truly be forgotten." My chest tightened. "But why me? I didn't know any of this." "Objects like this don't choose randomly," Whitlock replied, his gaze steady. "They seek out those who can carry their burdens, sometimes to return them to their rightful place, or worse, to tether the next keeper." "What do you mean, return them?" His eyes softened with a hint of pity. "If you don't return it, the locket's influence will grow. It's already begun, hasn't it? The dreams, the whispers, the feeling of being watched." I nodded, fear tightening its grip around me. "There's a chance you can end this," he continued. "But you must return it to where it belongs, Eleanor's home. It's the only way to sever the bond." I left the shop with the locket weighing heavier in my pocket, Whitlock's final warning echoing in my mind. "Be cautious," he'd said. "The locket will resist. It doesn't want to leave." Eleanor's home was a sprawling, decaying mansion on the outskirts of town. It loomed at the end of a narrow, overgrown path, its windows like darkened eyes that watched my every step. The air grew colder as I approached, the trees bending inward as though trying to block my path. The locket's warmth against my chest grew stronger, pulsing like a second heartbeat. I could feel it resisting, as though it knew I intended to part ways with it. My fingers trembled as I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my weight. The front door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for me. Inside, the house was a museum of decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters. Faded wallpaper peeled in jagged strips, revealing the bare wood beneath. But there was something else, an energy that hummed in the air, heavy and oppressive. I stepped into the parlor, the locket seeming to guide me. The room was eerily intact, unlike the rest of the house. A single chair sat in the center, facing an ornate mirror framed in tarnished gold. The mirror's surface was cloudy, but as I moved closer, my reflection came into view. Except it wasn't my reflection. The woman from my dream stared back at me, her dark eyes filled with sorrow and something darker. Expectation. Her lips didn't move, but her voice filled the room. "You've come." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I couldn't move. The locket burned against my skin, anchoring me in place. "You have what is mine," she continued, her voice low and resonant. "You must return it." I don't know how," I stammered. The room grew colder, and the mirror seemed to ripple like water. Eleanor extended a hand toward me through the glass. "Place it here," she commanded. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the locket's chain. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging me to comply. As I lifted the locket, the air around me thickened, pressing against my chest. I reached toward the mirror, but the instant the locket touched its surface, the room erupted in sound, a low, mournful wail that reverberated through my bones. Eleanor's figure grew clearer, her features softening, as if freed from a long torment. "You've done well," she said, her tone laced with gratitude, and something else I couldn't place. The locket dissolved into the mirror, leaving only my reflection behind. The air lightened, the oppressive energy dissipating. But as I turned to leave, a faint whisper reached my ears. "Thank you, but it isn't over." The warning chilled me, but I forced myself to step out of the house. Behind me, the mansion seemed quieter, almost peaceful. Yet a part of me knew the story wasn't truly finished. Something still lingered, just out of reach. The drive home was a blur. The weight that had hung over me since the day I first touched the locket seemed lighter now, though not entirely gone. The whispers had ceased, and the oppressive pull of the locket was no longer there. Yet the air around me felt brittle, as though something unseen waited just beyond my peripheral vision. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of burnt orange and deep indigo. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. The quiet was almost suffocating, the absence of the locket's presence more unnerving than its prior intensity. I tried to distract myself, switching on the television and flipping aimlessly through channels. But my mind kept returning to the image of Eleanor in the mirror, her sorrowful eyes, and the strange tone of her final words. It isn't over. What had she meant? The thought sent a chill through me, but I pushed it aside, clinging to the fragile sense of calm. That night, I dreamed again. I was standing in the decaying mansion, the parlor lit by a pale, unnatural light. The mirror stood before me, its surface smooth and gleaming. This time Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, my own reflection stared back, unnervingly still. My chest tightened as the figure in the mirror began to move, tilting its head in a way I hadn't. Its lips curled into a smile that didn't belong to me. "You think it's over," the reflection said, its voice layered with echoes. "You think you've won?" I tried to speak, but my voice was trapped, swallowed by the dream. The reflection's grin widened, and its eyes darkened, hollowing into black voids. "The locket was never the end," it whispered. "Only the beginning." I woke with a start, my body drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, the faint hum of the radiator the only sound. I sat up, clutching my chest as my breathing slowed. It was just a dream, I told myself, though the lingering dread in my gut suggested otherwise. As I glanced toward the window, my heart stopped. The reflection was there, clear as day, staring at me from the glass. My breath hitched as it tilted its head, mirroring the movement from the dream. Its lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the faint outline of frost on the pane. The whispers returned that morning. They were faint, like an echo from far away, but unmistakable. Their words weren't as insistent this time, more like a reminder of their presence. I told myself I was imagining things, but every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every mirror held something just out of place. It was as though the air around me had shifted subtly, a faint undercurrent of wrongness that I couldn't shake. Weeks passed, and the sensations dulled, but never disappeared entirely. I found myself avoiding mirrors, the reflective surfaces of windows, even the gleam of my kitchen sink. Something always seemed to lurk just beneath, waiting for me to look too long. I returned to Whitlock's shop in search of answers, but it was boarded up, the windows dark. A for lease sign hung crookedly on the door. He had vanished, leaving no trace behind, as though he had never existed at all. Time marched on, and life regained a semblance of normalcy. Yet, late at night, when the world was quiet, I would still hear faint whispers threading through the air. They were never loud enough to understand, but their presence was undeniable. On occasion, I would catch a flicker of movement in a mirror, or feel the faint brush of cold air against the back of my neck when no window was open. And then there was the locket. Though I had watched it dissolve into the mirror in Eleanor's parlor, I sometimes felt its weight around my neck. I would reach up, my fingers brushing against bare skin, and yet the sensation would persist, a phantom of its presence, a reminder of the bond that had been forged. I began to wonder if I had truly severed the connection, or if I had only traded one tether for another. Eleanor's story had ended, her spirit freed from the locket, but something remained, lingering in the spaces between shadows and silence. The whispers grew fainter as the months passed, but they never disappeared entirely. They were a constant undercurrent, a reminder that some bonds cannot be fully broken. I began to accept their presence, to live with the knowledge that the world I thought I knew was only a veneer over something far stranger, far darker. On the rare nights when the air feels unnaturally still and the shadows in my apartment stretch farther than they should, I remember Eleanor's final words, and I can't help but wonder if the locket, wherever it is now, is waiting for someone else, someone who will feel its pull and make the same grave mistake.